Alright guys, so I'm challenging myself to teach you how to use a camera in just 10 minutes, how you can shoot in manual mode, and basically going to teach you the 3 things that make up around 80% of what photography is. So we're just going to jump straight into it. I'm not going to rush myself. I'm going to be clear and concise about it, but I'm not going to rush myself. I'm going to take my time, make sure everything is explained properly, just trying to do it in a rapid fashion. But I've already wasted enough time on the intro, so let's jump straight into it. The 3 things that I'm going to be teaching you about here are the 3 main settings on your camera, the 3 things that are going to make up each and every photo that you take. Number 1 is going to be shutter speed. Number 2 is going to be aperture. And number 3 is going to be ISO. So we'll start with shutter speed. Shutter speed is literally just how fast your camera is opening its shutter to take the photo. So when you take a picture of something, what you're actually doing is you're opening up the shutter inside your camera, exposing the sensor in your camera to the light from the outside world, and it is reading that light and creating the picture using that light. So the light that is bouncing off of rocks, off of walls, off of people, off of animals, that light is going into your camera and it's creating that image of that animal or that rock or whatever it may be. And that's essentially simplified how a camera works. So when you open up your shutter, you are letting that image in. So your shutter speed is just how long you let that shutter be open, how long you let that image in for. Now the longer that you keep your shutter open, as you can imagine, then you're letting in more light. The shorter that you keep that shutter open, the less light you're letting in. So if you take a look at this image right here, I shot this at 1/200th of a second here. And as you can see, it is a pretty dark image. It wasn't exposed properly. I didn't have my shutter speed as low as it needed to go. I needed to have that shutter open for longer to properly get the right amount of light in this photo, to let the right amount of light into my lens. So if you take a look at this photo then, you can see here I had this open for 0.8 seconds. So this was almost a full second that the shutter was open for an image like this, as opposed to 1/200th of a second. And as you can see in this one, this is a lot brighter of a photo than this one. You can see the huge change in lighting there, and that is because of that change in shutter speed. Now there was some other settings that also affected that, but primarily in this image what you're seeing is that change in shutter speed. You're seeing how if I change how fast or how long I leave that shutter open for, then I'm changing how much light I'm letting into my camera to expose the image and to create what that image actually looks like and how bright that image is. So that's what you're seeing here, but you may also notice in this image that changing the shutter speed actually has some side effects. If you look in this, the water back here has a little bit of motion blur to it. You can see that in the bubbles back here. You can see that in how silky and smooth this water is and how it's coming off of this waterfall and kind of spraying out. And then if I go over to this image, you can see how it is not doing that, and I'll actually brighten this up. You can see in this image that you can see each individual droplet coming down off of the waterfall. You can actually see them falling down. You can see them frozen in time because, as you can imagine, I left that shutter open for only 1/200th of a second. So it just flipped open in a very, very fast fashion. It captured that exact moment. That 1/200th of a second moment was captured, so I was able to freeze the motion of this water. But if you look at an image like this, I had this open for 0.8 seconds, almost a full second. So the motion in these bubbles and in this waterfall was captured by it, because the longer that that shutter is open for, right, if I left it open for almost a second, then this water was moving that whole time. So my sensor was reading while the shutter was open all of that water flow. So it actually captured the motion of that water. It captured all the water that came off this waterfall. All the time that these bubbles moved was captured by the camera because my shutter was open during that entire time. And so through using shutter speed, you can not only darken your images and lighten your images, you can also add some motion blur to your images. If you leave that shutter open for a little longer, it's going to capture the motion of whatever's going on in the image, and it's going to create a better story in a lot of cases. For example, in this one, using a longer shutter speed is allowing me to create a more compelling image. It's allowing me to creatively make some decisions by extending my shutter speed to make the image look better and add some motion blur to the image. And so that is shutter speed in a nutshell. Now moving on to the second setting. The next one is aperture. Aperture is the size of the hole through which you're letting your image in through. So in the end of your camera lens, you actually have a hole that you're letting that image pass through so that the camera can actually read it. You can shrink the size of that hole with aperture, or you can expand the size of that hole. It can be a larger hole or smaller hole inside of your lens, and that's basically when you adjust your aperture what you're doing. And by creating a larger hole, you're letting in more light. Obviously, just like with shutter speed, when you open the shutter for longer, it lets in more light, creates a brighter image. Same thing with aperture. When you make that hole larger, you're letting in more light because there's more area for that light to pass through. When you shrink that hole down, you're letting in less light because obviously there's less room for that light to pass through to create the image. So aperture is just another way to, lighten or darken your images, to expose your images properly. But just like shutter speed, aperture has some side effects. If you take a look at this photo here, you can see that this rock is the only thing in focus. This waterfall in the background is not in focus. And I'll brighten it up a bit so you can see a little bit better here. But you can see that this is nice and sharp in focus on this rock, whereas this waterfall out here is all blurred out in the background. If you look at my aperture was f4, which is a wide open aperture. That's a very large aperture there. And it's kind of confusing. I don't know why it's this way. Well, I do, but it's very complicated to explain why it's this way. But the smaller the number, the larger the aperture. So like f4 is a very large aperture. If I was at f32, it would be a very small aperture. Again, I know it doesn't make sense. I know it should be the opposite way. You would think the larger number, larger aperture, but that's not how it is. Larger aperture is smaller numbers. So for this image, I was at f4, a pretty large aperture here. And having that large aperture has a side effect, like I said. And the side effect here is that it really shrinks your depth of field. And your depth of field is just how much of your field of view is in focus. So for example, in this image with that wide open aperture there, I've got only a little bit in focus because my aperture is so large. So only this rock is in focus. In the background, all this is out of focus because my depth of field is very, very small with that large aperture. So I'm able to put the focus on just a specific subject. However, if you take a look at this image, you can see that everything is in focus. And if you look at my aperture here, it was at f11. So shrinking that aperture actually allowed for more of the image to be in focus. The smaller the aperture, the more depth of field you're going to get, and the more in focus everything is going to be. The smaller the aperture, then the less depth of field you'll get, and you'll be able to get that background blur and put the focus solely on your subject. So that's the side effect of aperture, and that is basically aperture in a nutshell. And your third and final setting is ISO, and ISO is a more recent development. Aperture and shutter speed have been there since the start of time, since the start of cameras. But ISO has really just come into play since the rise of DSLRs about 20 to 30 years ago. And to best explain ISO, I want to show you these two images. So this first one here was taken at ISO 100, f8, 1 second. And the reason that I did that is because I wanted to put a lot in focus. So I went for that smaller aperture, f8. So I was able to put a lot more in focus with the waterfall, and not the rock wasn't fully in focus here, but you have some focus on the rock. I wanted to put it at 1 second so that I could add some nice smoothness to this waterfall back here and have that flow to that. But then I have ISO 100, which is the base ISO on my camera. That's the lowest you can go on ISOs. But as you can see, this image is a little bit too dark. This just doesn't have enough light to it. So what did I do? I increased my ISO. So if you can see on the settings on this one, I kept the exact same aperture and shutter speed, 1 second and f8. But my ISO I took up to 500, and that is basically what ISO does. Just like shutter speed and aperture, ISO either brightens or darkens your image, depending on if you're raising your ISO up or lowering your ISO. So like I said, as you can see, 500 ISO, brighter image, 100 ISO, darker image. However, there's a side effect. Just like with aperture, just like with shutter speed, there's a side effect of ISO. And to show you that, I want you to first take a look at this image. I'm going to zoom in to 300%. Take a look in these dark areas over here. I'm going to brighten it up a little bit so that you can see a little better. Take a look at these rocks in here. If you notice, there's some pretty good detail maintained in those. Overall, pretty sharp, pretty good detail in those. This image was taken at base ISO. But if I go over to one of my earlier images, if you take a look at this one, this is 2000 ISO. And I zoom in on that same area, you can see how much detail is lost. Even if I raise up that exposure and brighten it up a bit, you can see how much detail I've lost in this image as opposed to this image. Look at that loss in detail there. It's just so much loss and so much more grain in your image, so much more noise in the water, in the waterfall, on the rocks up here, so much more noise all over this image. And that is the side effect of raising your ISOs. Unfortunately, when you brighten up that image with ISO, you get a lot more noise in your image and you lose a lot of the quality of your image. So ISO is something to be very, very careful with. And that is your third and final setting, ISO in a nutshell. Now to do a quick recap, we have 3 settings. We have shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long the shutter is open for to let the image into your camera. The longer the shutter is open, the brighter the image will be. but shutter speed also has a side effect of capturing motion blur. Next is aperture. Aperture is how big the hole is in your lens that you're letting the image in through. The smaller the hole, the darker the image. The larger the hole, the brighter the image. Aperture also has a side effect of affecting your depth of field. ISO is your third and final one. ISO is a way of adding light to your image when you've already set your aperture and your shutter speed. The higher ISOs introduce more noise, so you want to keep your ISOs as low as possible. And that's it. Those are your 3 settings for cameras. Knowing these 3 is your basic stepping stone into photography. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do not forget to subscribe to be entered for that 1,000 subscriber Manatee Swim giveaway. See you on the next one.